Now I'm going to start off this video by pointing out and reminding everyone I taught history of engineering. I am a historian. I have a PhD in war studies. I am not, nor do I ever pretend to be, a chemical engineer. But I'm going to be talking a lot about chemical engineering. Now, the scary thing about teaching history of engineering is occasionally I did get the chance to correct the engineers about the engineering because they would try talking about old engineering, pieces of engineering which they had long since stopped using and they really didn't understand because the whole principles had changed. Unfortunately, chemical engineering is one of those areas where they don't so much stop using processes as evolve them, so that's never going to happen here. So if you're a chemical engineer, I do apologize if I get things wrong. I know I'm doing it from my notes, and I have notes because I did used to teach. When I say used to teach, and when I explain I taught history of engineering, and I'm giving this at the beginning just to explain this, I taught it primarily to civil engineers, mechanical engineers, and aerospace engineers. And that was what I taught for most of the time. And then, but as time went on, they added more and more other engineering students to my course. They basically decided, right, and we're going to harmonize, and this guy does quite a good skills course, etc., for the first years that helps them prep, and we're just going to add in more and more and more. And then eventually COVID hit, and so we stopped doing it, and then I don't think it's taught now. I don't think it's part of the. I no longer at that at the university, so that's a time and a half ago. But I did end up with chemical engineers in there, but I think I only had them for like the last year before COVID hit. So yeah, it was a while ago, but I did have some stuff for them, and I did use Japan as the example. And the thing is, Japan's in a really interesting situation in 1920s and 30s. They have fairly decent coal production, and by the way, for those wondering where I'm getting my facts and figures and what I'm basing this all in, I'm basically going to show you a couple of pictures, but it all comes from this lovely PDF, which you can go and track down. And the fact that the bracket has dropped down is something I have just noticed. And now I fixed the bracket, let's carry on. But yes, it all comes from the effects of strategic bombing on Japan's war economy. It's a lovely document. It's 264 pages long, of quite a large chunk of it being data tables. It's the sort of document which I love to spend a few hours in. And it's a really useful starting point. You also have to remember that, to an extent, that document is written by people who are trying to make the case for strategic bombing. Okay? I'm not saying there's lies in there. There are not. And please note, that's not usually what happens with documents. Putting outright lies in an official document gets you in trouble is something that's easy to disprove by people trying to make the other case. But presenting your evidence in the best possible light for your argument. So what I'm saying is, nothing in there is factually incorrect. But do wonder if some of the negatives and some of the problems are ironed out or minimized. Now, with that all being said, Japan produces a fairly decent amount of coal, and they have even more that's available to them in Manchuria, and this is a useful thing. Coal is useful. They don't produce much of their own oil. They have a little bit. They have a little bit of domestic production. And realistically, as helpful as that can be, that's not enough to service their needs. That is not enough to service their needs. It's also not enough to alleviate some of the issues in their economy. And some of what we're going to talk about, and especially as we're going to get into the alternate history after the shameless book plug, but we're going to talk about history of it, is the fact that the Japanese economy, realistically, when war begins, has to almost regress in part. There are factions of the economy which almost shut down, or the domestic economy which almost shut down, because of the lack of supplies, because they need to send it off to other things. Now, what we're talking about when we're talking about synthetic fuels, and especially lubricants, as well as oil as in fuel, but lubricants, and the various hydrocarbon chemicals which are used in modern defense industries, etc., these can be as important as getting fuel. Okay? So, the thing is, synthetic plants, they might not produce enough fuel for you. In fact, it's almost impossible that you are going to get enough fuel. It is impossible you're going to get enough fuel for your economy. If you look at the sheer amount, and one of the good things about these tables you go through is you can see how much Japan's using. The sheer amount Japan's using and the sheer amount they need to use, they are not going to be getting enough fuel from synthetic means. But lubricants, hydrocarbon chemicals, if you can make up for the loss of them and make up the losses of some of the fuel in some parts of your civilian sectors, your economic sectors, let's say petrol, well, that can help your economy in other ways. That can make your economy far more productive. And if your economy is more productive, that can put you in a better position. Now, one of the interesting things is, this is nothing new that I'm talking about today. And I'll get on to that. Japan itself does start investing from about 1937 onwards in developing synthetic fuels and other things in Manchuria and other areas, because they think that's going to be necessary. But realistically, that is way too late. The interesting question, and the question we're answering here, is Japan goes synthetic for oil in the 1930s, and to my mind, that means not 1937, that means you start at the beginning of 1930. You start 1930. So you push back your starting point roughly 7 years. And you do it domestically as well as in terms of their imperial conquests. That's an interesting option. That is an interesting option. Because coal is not really something Japan is short of in the war. But what Japan is short of, and that's something which will bite them on the behind, excuse the French, is realistically a central direction of energy policy. You need someone. Now, theoretically, as of 1925, that should have been under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. But the Ministry of Commerce and Industry is kind of an interesting organisation, and they're the same group who in 1934 decide that they are going to divest from their iron and steel industry, which forms the Nippon Steel Company, or Nippon Steel Corporation. Nippon Steel Corporation. Sorry, I was around a second one. And they are an interesting organisation, but by most of the way through World War II, the Ministry of Munitions, the Ministry of Transport and Communications, and the Planning Board have taken on pretty much most of their functions, and what was left of the Ministry of Commerce was merged into the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry to become the Ministry of Agriculture and Commerce in 1943. In simple terms, the organisation and part of the Japanese government, which should have been in charge of preparations and organising and preparing all this stuff and making sure the Japanese economy was as robust and secure as possible, was doing a terrible job at it. You can argue the reasons why. One, they're not allowed to do a good job in the nicest way. They just aren't. Two, the ministers they get are not exactly what you call the front rank of Japanese ministers at the time. They are often fairly good in terms of people. They're just not great in terms of being able to actually take control of the political capabilities and, run them. And also, they don't usually get to be in power for that long. It's one of those organizations which goes through ministers like hot potatoes. I mean, this is an organization which is formed, as said, in 1924-25, and by 1943 they've had 25 different ministers. Now, yes, some of them as ministers are reappointed for a second term and all those things, but in the nicest way, that's kind of a fun times for all, isn't it? That's not exactly going to build up experience. I think, actually, no, Godo Taku does do that 3 times, so yeah, he maybe is not 25 ministers, but they had 25 different appointments. So not all different people, but yeah, 25 different appointments for ministers. It's not an organisation which is going to get a lot of support. And during the war, well, for some reason, America takes the policy of taking out Japan's energy infrastructure is A-OK and preferred option. It's almost as if you take out one of the core pillars of a modern economy, you can destabilize it and undermine it. And that's what they do. So, the proposal is, of course, synthetic oil and synthetic fuels and lubricants. And how do you make these? How do you get these? Well, you have 2 real options. 2. And this is where I once again remind you, I am not a chemical engineer. You have the Burgess process, which is where coal is liquefied by being heated with large amounts of hydrogen gas. This tends to be called hydrogenation. Then the dry coal is mixed with heavy oil recycled from the process. Catalysts are added, and you have a theoretically usable fuel. The only problem with the Burgess process is, as efficient as it is, the largest plants could produce 200 tons a day of fuel. There's not a lot of fuel. That is not a lot of fuel. And that was in Germany. Germany's largest plant during World War II could produce 200 tons a day of fuel. You then have the Fischer-Tropsch process. Either coal, natural gas, or biomass undergo a process of gasification. Then they are put through a series of chemical reactions to convert them into liquid hydrocarbons, which can be made into fuel. It's more efficient, broadly speaking, than the Burgess process, especially in terms of volume, okay? More efficient in terms of volume produced. Less efficient, I seem to remember, in terms of energy consumption, but it accounted for roughly 9% of Germany's war production fuels and 25% of their petrol. That's kind of useful. Okay. Now, Germany goes massively into this. They do go massively into this, and it's sensible for them to do so. Because for Germany, realistically, this is more critical about making most efficient use of the fuels they have available. And it's rare for me to give Nazi Germany's government any credit with efficiency, because really they are great at looking efficient and actually terrible once you actually look into the detail of what they claim is efficient. Slave labor sounds great until you realize, hang on, if you don't feed and train your labor properly, you tend to get badly produced stuff anyway. That's even if they like you. If they dislike you, they can find hundreds of interesting ways to produce terrible components and do shoddy work. Yeah, Slave labour. Not good for complicated processes or machining. Who'd have thunk it? And I know quite a huge amount of slave labour is used for basic construction, those things. I do realise that, but there's also other areas where they try to use slave labour for factory work, and it's not sensible. It just isn't. But in this scenario, you do have some options here. Now, please note, there are other options. There are other methodologies of doing this, and I do expect someone to list below all the different options that you could go with. But realistically, with the technologies available at the time, these are the most productive versions you can realistically go for. There are two other options which are sort of up there, but especially if you're looking for 1930 start, and you're looking conservative, because let's be honest, the Japanese government is always very conservative in its procurement and industrial selections. They're going to go for the most proven processes, which are going to be these two. They are going to be. So, that's your option. That is your option. Now, if we consider the actual history, what Japan actually did historically, that's an interesting thing. Because historically, they have huge amounts of production of coal and other materials coming out of Manchuria. They are focused on it. They have decided that instead of investing internally, they'll go and get the resources from themselves externally. Now, it's an option. It's always an option to focus, instead of investing on infrastructure and development, on internal acquisition of resources, to go and get it externally. It tends to be quicker if those facilities are already available and you can take them. If you have to develop them, then you're putting a lot of money into developing infrastructure and industry in places other than your own country, but, you can look at it as access to materials. Cost of doing business. But realistically, the worst thing that happens here is that they go through the whole hog of building synthetic fuel production, and most of it is really set up in Manchuria. And that means that it's no help to the home islands at all, because they have to bring it home. And they have to take it out elsewhere as well. It's not where it can be used readily with other industries. They have to be able to transport it into you, which means they have to put it on a ship and bring it to Japan. And as we know from the course of World War II, that's not a good idea for Japan. That really isn't. And they only start the investment in 1937, which means realistically they have 2 years before Germany's at war, and they no longer have easy access to Germany for resources in terms of personnel, equipment, and technology they need. And it means they only had 2 years to really develop their own skills and understanding of it. So those plants, as efficient and as capable as they are never used realistically to their full maximum capacity. And the Japanese don't have the ability to really grow the production and transplant it further because they don't have enough experience. This is the point about starting things earlier. Now, usually at this point, when I've started saying something like that, someone's going to stick their hand up and go, but, the Japanese are very smart. Surely they can do this. No one is saying anyone is dumb. It's all very smart. But you think about it, you think about some of the smartest people, brain surgeons, let's say. They're usually pretty darn smart. I think we can all agree with that. They take years to learn how to do the things they're going to do. They take years, decades, for some surgeries, to develop and understand them and before they can do them. If you are going from being able to operate to build under supervision, to design and build your own plants, there is a lot of not just theory needed to be absorbed, but practical experience needed to be transferred. And you have two options of doing that. One, you hire in the people, which is going to be a bootstrap to train your own people up and pass on their experience. Or two, you try and develop it all from scratch, which is going to be the most expensive way. It does provide you for the organic capabilities, but expect to make a lot of mistakes on the way. Those are your options. Those options become very limited the moment war begins. Because can you afford to have to waste the resources in wartime of doing the second option? And can you get the people and the resources and technology necessary to do the first option in wartime conditions? You can't. So honestly, 1937, as good as it was a good idea to get into this, it was too late. And the options and what you need done, well, they're interesting. And the factors you really need to start thinking of is that in 1940, Japan is importing, and it's this one, I think, it's on this panel, this is on the panel at the top. There you go. 1 million barrels of lubricating oil. 1 million barrels of lubricating oil. That's a lot. That is a lot. And the thing is, if you can reduce that down, the import, earlier on, that helps. It also helps you build up a stockpile early on. But most importantly, when you start looking at it, whilst Japan is importing a lot of crude oil, trust me, Japan, in 1940, it's 22 million barrels. They are importing 1.5 million barrels of aviation fuel. They're importing basically 4.3 million barrels of petrol. Nearly 8 million barrels of diesel. Their total import is something like 37.2 million barrels of fuel they are importing in 1940. And that is just the crude and refined oils imported to the inner zone, as far as it's considered. So yeah, Poodle's left me to go to bed. Doesn't even say goodnight. Anyway, leaving that to one side. That is a lot. That is a lot. And when you start going looking at the consumption of liquid fuels and lubricants, well, that starts to get really, really interesting. Of what they're consuming, what they're taking in, what they're utilizing. That's a lot. And, if you're talking about petrol, the civilian sector alone is using 6.3 million barrels. Yeah. They're importing, that's the important point to remember. In terms of petrol, they are importing 4.3. So their domestic supply is able to sustain their army and navy. It's able to sustain a chunk of their civilian. Because their total usage is 7.8. They're importing 4.3. What does that mean? What am I talking about synthetic fuels when I'm talking about this? Well, let's put it this way. If you could up synthetic fuel production to a level at which it could take up even a small portion of that, then your economy is going to be far less affected. Because the shortfall of 4.3 is going to entirely come from your civilian economy and entirely shut you down. You can't afford that. Aviation fuel, diesel fuel, lubricants, all these things. The fact is, Japan can get a certain amount from their own economy and from their own supplies and the limited fuel and limited oil fields they have themselves. Not a lot, but they get some. Their weakness is that a huge chunk of their economy is dependent upon imports. Anything which reduces the dependence on imports, therefore, is going to be good. And that leads us to the shameless book plug. So normally I say thank you for liking, sharing, and subscribing, and at this point I start talking about my book and a few things. The shameless book plug, but I'm actually going to tell you that I don't know how long this video is going to be, because I wanted to give you a sort of bit of background information before it. I wanted to give you roughly 20 minutes. I'd worked it out it was going to be, and it was about 26 minutes. And I've got roughly 15 points I want to make and discuss over the next 2 slides I've got for what comes next. Discussing it. And realistically, I'm going to take in a slightly different route than probably was intended, because the only way I see this happening, I'm going to explain this in this bit, using this bit to explain it, is if Japan has a joined up energy policy from about 1925. Basically, they get someone good who manages to hold on to power through multiple administrations and builds up the commerce department, the industry department, into something which is providing Japan with a level of resilience for their economy and a level of independence for their economy that allows them far more freedom of action, so that they are less weak on the world stage when it comes to others interfering in their plans. Basically, they start to treat industry and energy and commerce as another pillar of the state, like the army and navy. And this is not without possibilities. There are 3 potential options. There is Takahashi Koryoku, who was Viscount Takahashi Koryoku, who had actually served as Prime Minister from 1921 to 1922, had been Minister of Finance and had various other experiences. He was the person responsible for introducing patent system, getting financing for the Russo-Japanese War from various foreign countries, and trying to fix a lot of the economy. He's credited with pulling Japan out of depression, but after his assassination, there's a lot of soaring inflation, and basically because, frankly, they couldn't run the system like he did. There is also Noda Ataro, who is a noted entrepreneur and cabinet minister, who's the second minister. Unfortunately, he does die in 1927, age 73. Takahashi Koryoku dies in 1936, aged 81. And there's also Kataoka Naoru, who, well, he was also pretty darn good at getting things working. And they're all very passionate. They're all very pro their country, but of course, Naharu dies 1934, age 74. Basically, you need someone like them, one of them, and they need to be able to be in power for at least 10 years. Which basically means it has to, by default, because the only one who lives long enough historically is Takahashi Koryoku, who is the only one who makes it in 1936. So he is, yes, he's 81, but basically you need him to be around for 10 years to build this sort of thing up. And he's the first minister anyway, so we'd be basically saying he would take it on in April 1924, and it wouldn't be until he died in 1936 he'd lose it. And he would form it into a major part of Japan. That's the only way we can really make this work. And that's the idea I'm going with. So I used the Shameless Book Plug to sort of begin the explanation of that, so when I start talking about it in the next bit, you'll know why. So, for this all to work, for Japan to be in a better position than it was historically, it needs to take one sensible decision when it comes out of World War One. It needs to not sit in its laurels and think, I did a great job, that war was brilliant, I am brilliant at war, I am brilliant in the world, I can keep winning wars like this. It needs to sit there and look at Germany and think, hang on, what happened to them? They got blockaded, and they got into real trouble. Okay. We don't have the living space, we don't have the population in the sort of the right mode of moving from agricultural and low-scale industrialization to high-grade industrialization that they will achieve post-World War II. We're on that trajectory, but we're not there yet. We need to be more independent and be in a better position. How do we fix that? How do we fix that? Well, starters, they've got to start looking at the stuff they have. One of the interesting things I found for Japan is, if you consider their resilience and everything they're doing, why they did not have more coal-powered merchant ships built in the 20s and 30s, I do not know. Because yes, fuel is the coming technology, and the fuel is the coming system. Oil is the coming technology, it's the coming fuel, but Japan actually has coal supplies in large amounts, and there are lots of systems you can make to make coaling a ship and to be running to run coal automated as much as you can, mechanize it as much as you can, so that you can have minimal people involved. And that's pretty much what you need to do. What you need to do to organize things. You also need to start working out how you're going to spread out your industry. How you're going to encourage it to be spread out and not concentrated in areas so it's more survivable. So it's less easy to be bombed or bombarded by enemies. You've got to find a way to integrate it, so you've got to actually get your railways to work together. And of course, synthetic fuel. Not to replace the fuel so much as to replace all the lubricants and chemicals you can. This might sound strange, because we normally talk about modern navies, modern armies, etc., floating on a never-ending sea of fuel. They do. But here's the thing. It is often easier to buy and store large quantities of fuel. Trust me, Britain did it around the empire. So did a few other powers. Then look at their ability to buy and store a lot of the very, very special lubricants and chemicals which can be got from the various processes around hydrocarbons. You'll find that's a lot more difficult. And those are a lot more expensive, and they run out. Now, why, again, it is quite good to be pursuing a synthetic fuel production and a synthetic fuels or lubricants production in that case? Well, because it's a good economic case for it. Okay, you're going to be providing a high value commodity. So it's going to make a profit. You're going to be able to sell it to others. You're going to be able to export it. As well as build up your own stockpiles, you're going to be able to export it. And you don't need to create that higher volume to satisfy your own need, relatively speaking. Now, the other thing you might want to pursue is petrol. Okay, remember the huge gap between the petrol being used and by vehicles, especially civilian industry and civilians, versus the and how much of that was imported. If you could reduce that by 25%, if you could produce 1 million barrels domestically every year, and if we do the rough conversion, it's roughly 7.5 barrels of oil equals a single ton. So when we talked about that factory in Germany producing 200 by the Burgers process a day, 200 tons, another way of putting that would have been saying it was producing 1,500 barrels a day. 1,500 barrels times 365. Well, that is a fairly large amount. It's a little over 500,000 barrels a year. You have 2 or 3 plants of that size turning out. You've suddenly solved quite a lot of your petrol shortage. Or rather, you've reduced your petrol shortage by 1.5 million barrels a year. That means should war happen and you find yourself being cut off by others putting, artificial shortages on you by sanctions, etc. Instead of you being short 4.3, you're now short 2.8. And that means you've got maybe dropping a third from your whole economy. That's a far easier thing to deal with than losing over half your fuel supply. And yes, that is going to require you make more efficient production of coal. That is going to require you boost production of coal, boost production of probably existing fuel domestically. There is going to be trade-offs. There is going to have to be infrastructure improvements. One of the really big things you can do is try and electrify your lines. So instead of you having to import diesel for trains or use coal for engines themselves inefficiently, you can use coal power stations, which can take far less, far less high quality coal. They can take far less processed coal than steam engines can the trains, and use that to generate electricity to supply them. There are options for how you improve this, but this is going to be a multi-year project. Again, you're not aiming for autarky, you're aiming for resilience. And the thing is, if you start at this point and then 1924-25 you have this ministry formed and you start pushing forward with it, you can do a lot of things. You can build up an economy which, no, it is not going to be invulnerable to outside actions. And please note, I'm not claiming that in any way, shape or form. But you can make it so that you have time to sort things out. You are able to stretch any supplies, any reserves that much further. You are able to ameliorate issues. And also, should someone start sanctioning you, you do not have to react out of fear. This is one of the things about resilience when nations invest in it. They give themselves options. Now, the thing about options is they give you time. It's kind of like if you have solar panels and batteries for your house, if you have those things, and maybe even a little micro turbine or something like that. All those things, great systems to have. They give you a bit of resilience. Are they going to keep your quality of life going if the world goes to pot tomorrow? No. Are they going to give you a few weeks breathing space while you can sort yourself out with your fridge and everything still running? Give you time to see what comes out of it, to make decisions with a breathing room? Yes. And it's the same with resilience for nation states. If you do this investment, if you do this construction, you can actually give yourself time. And you can give yourself the ability to make decisions. Now, during World War II, are the Japanese still going to be at a massive disadvantage if they end up in World War II? Yes. But if you've got this kind of system set up, if you've managed to introduce enough diverse application of it, and probably if you've got the state involved and they're worrying about diverse application, you're probably going to see a fairly large amount of construction of it put into places where it's going to be difficult to take it out, difficult to damage it. Either it's going to be in narrow valleys, which are very difficult to do bomb runs on, or it's going to maybe be buried underground, or it's going to be dispersed, and there's going to be lots of different nodes. All those are options for how you could construct it, so that bombing from the air could be very, very difficult. But what I will say is this. The big advantages for Japan are going to come from greater economic resilience and greater industrial and infrastructure resilience from such investments. They're going to come from the greater independence it's going to give them in terms of the world market. They're going to be less dictatable to, and their timeline is not going to be dictated by others. That is the really interesting thing, because in some ways, Japan's timeline for operations in World War II are dictated constantly by their fuel supplies. It's amazing what happens to that dictation if you have an extra 10% in terms of domestic fuel production, and fuel production, and your lubricants are taken care of, and some of your chemicals are taken care of. It's amazing what's able to be made operational in terms of your aircraft, in terms of systems you have to run. You think about it, you still have access to high quality lubricants. You can run your engines that much harder. You can run your engines that much hotter. All these things can have an impact on how your force operates and how successful it is. It's not going to change the outcome of World War II. What it might do, and I do mean this as a might, is it might well buy you more time, that you don't find yourself in that situation in the first place and reacting out of pain and fear rather than logic and thinking things through. But it only works if you realistically invest as much as you can to give yourself the strength you need. Okay? This means, again, you have to think things through. What can you run off coal? What can you run off oil? What kind of oil can you supply? How can you better use the resources? You need to treat industry and energy as this third branch of government, third branch of the nation state in terms of its strength. But you have to do it in such a way that both embraces commercial realities and means that the private sector, the civilian sector, pays for as much as it can, but also that the government is stepping in, like they did in Manchuria, to encourage the construction of synthetic fuel plants there, with tax breaks, or sometimes with direct investment, or with actually just building it themselves. It's a really interesting scenario, because if you look at all the governments in the 1920s and early 1930s, Very few of them want to take a direct involvement in their economy. Doesn't matter whether they are democracies or authoritarian. Doesn't matter. Left wing, right wing. They're all trying to avoid getting involved in the economy. They're all laissez-faire. Let the government economy roll. And they're all stupid in a way. It is the right way to run an economy, yes. It is. You do not want to be dictating to the private sector, because the private sector will tend to be more efficient in its allocation of resources for commercial gain than the government can be, because it can usually adapt more quickly to market trends and changes without having to have the meetings and all the government oversight and all those things. Okay? However, the area you need governments to get involved in private sector and industry is resilience for the nation state, where the two overlap, where there are critical industries which frankly you need to make sure they work. If you want your shipbuilding industry to work, you need to make sure that that is profitable, but also to an extent functioning at a level at which you've always got some spare capacity sitting in there for emergency builds, should you need to ramp up construction. And you can do that by one of two ways. You can have royal dockyards, or you can have some kind of tax mechanism built into for the civilian dockyards. Those are sort of your options. If you want to have a joined up system where you have all this stuff invest in terms of synthetic fuels, etc., for the national economy, then you've probably got to do two things. One, you've got to give massive incentives in terms of upfront cash to help them build the infrastructure in the first place, and you've also got to invest in a tax regime which is going to make it economical not just to supply your own domestic market, but to export it. Why? Because your wartime needs are going to be far greater than your peacetime needs, and the easiest way to grow your production capacity is to have it exporting. Because in wartime it won't be exporting, but boy, can you soak up that excess for production. And you've got to do the same with your coal industry to support it, if you're Japan. And you've got to start thinking through how you're going to make all this stuff work. Because this kind of industry and infrastructure requires a modern logistics system, which means it's going to require your trains to be running, it's going to require your lorries to be running. And can you really afford to be running everything on a coastal trade basis when you're an island nation and your greatest fear is looking at what the experience of Britain during World War I and the experience of Germany during World War I is going to be blockade and minefields by enemy submarines? Realistically, if Japan had done a proper study of World War I and come out of it, they should have been thinking non-stop about resilience for the next 20 years. But that is a defensive mindset. I admit, thinking about resilience is a defensive mindset, and a lot of people find that very almost an affront to them. Not just Japan, but other nations. Think about the way some governments today act about things. They act as if they're always going to be on the offensive, as if they're always going to be dictating terms of any future conflict. Think about the infrastructure spending they're doing. There was a big joke put out recently in Britain because the British government are trying to include infrastructure investment as part of their NATO spending. Realistically, it should be there. But realistically, the infrastructure spending they're trying to tag in there is possibly not the right infrastructure spending. The thing is, what is infrastructure you need to keep your economy going in wartime that is going to be more heavily used, or is actually going to be under threat from the enemy? That's the infrastructure you need to have excess capacity in. Probably your railways are going to be under far heavier usage in wartime than they would be in peace. because you're going to be moving around a lot of heavy machinery and a lot of heavy materials, and railways are always more efficient for that than lorries because of volume. And, in energy production, and, probably these days data cables. In this time period, Japan, well, they needed to build a lot of communication systems internally. They needed to build telephone lines, everything. And they should be burying them, probably. But I can understand why they might not, if you consider the earthquakes and the other issues they have sitting where they do on the Pacific Ring of Fire. So, geological term for those who haven't heard it, describing the world around the Pacific tectonic plate and how it's littered with volcanoes, so it's a ring of fire. But there are things they need to do. There are systems they should be investing in order to give themselves a modicum of resilience they should be having. It would be a whole new strategy to build up this level of resilience. It would give them a whole new mindset in some regards. They'd probably still be dominated by the Army and Navy. They'd have a civilian ministry which could rival them for power and status, which the Army and Navy might not like, but considering how essential that ministry will be to them and their supplies, they'll probably tolerate. In fact, it'll probably become a thing of which one of allying with that ministry in order to get their way in government. And longer term, as said, this gives Japan options. It gives them timeline capabilities. It gives them the ability to withstand some of the pressures that they're going to be subject to. Anyway, that's enough of me rabbiting on. I hope you found this interesting, and thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, please do like, share, and subscribe. I always finish these videos on a question, and this question is going to be this. How do you think this would affect the wider Japanese preparations for war if they are pursuing a resilient strategy in terms of their infrastructure, in terms of their industry? What do you think else you're going to see? Are they going to build spare factories? Do you think they'd be producing more armor? Do you think they'd invest more in education? I personally think probably more in education, and I do think you might see more production of armored vehicles, because if you have a more guaranteed petrol and lubricant supply, you might well invest more in vehicles which are going to make use of them. But what do you think? What do you think they would be a likely course of action? And what else do we have coming up? Well, we have Andrew Cunningham's already happened this week, so next week it's ending the First Battle of the Somme, Profile of Hague, and that's going to be in one of the Historiathons videos. Literally, that's going to be the topic of the Tuesday Historiathon video. And then we've got Piet Pietzoen Hein, Dutchman who took a Spanish silver fleet. That should have been recorded and should be uploaded now, so people know that's coming up on the 25th. Because my plan is to have recorded the first two videos at least for after the Historiathon, so I have a couple of days of quiet after the Historiathon. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.